The sun was sinking low when the wagon finally rolled into the valley. The sky burned orange, and dust trailed behind like smoke from a dying fire. She clutched her small suitcase tight, fingers stiff from the cold. Her heart beat fast, too fast. Each turn of the wheel brought her closer to a life she didn't know, to a man she had never met. Somewhere in the distance, a horse neighed. Somewhere closer, her courage started to fade. When the wagon stopped, she didn't move at first. The driver called her name, gentle but impatient. She took a breath, then another, and stepped down. Her boots sank into the dry dirt. The air smelled of hay and sweat and something wild, freedom maybe, or fear. She looked around. The land stretched forever, quiet except for the wind brushing through tall grass. Nothing looked familiar. Nothing looked safe. Then she saw him. Standing near the wooden gate, hat tilted low, hands resting on his belt. He didn't speak. He just watched. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, but she could see the lines carved deep by sun and time. He looked strong, rough, unreadable. The kind of man who could break a horse or a heart. Her throat went dry. This was him, the man from the letters. The one who had promised her a home, a chance, a name that wasn't whispered in pity. She wanted to believe he was kind. She wanted to believe she had done the right thing. But his silence felt heavy, and her knees almost gave out under the weight of it. He took a few steps closer, boots crunching on gravel. The sound made her flinch. She looked down, pretending to adjust her dress, hiding the fear in her eyes. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for her to smell the faint scent of leather and tobacco. "You're her," he said, voice low and even. "The bride." She nodded, unable to speak. He studied her for a moment longer, then his mouth curved, not quite a smile, not quite a smirk. "Darlin, I don't bite," he said softly, his tone almost teasing. The air froze, her eyes lifted. He paused, eyes glinting under the brim. "Unless—" The wind picked up again, carrying his unfinished words across the open land. She hadn't told anyone when she left. There was no one left to tell. The morning she boarded that train, the sky over the city was the same pale gray as the smoke rising from the factory roofs. She'd stood there on the platform, clutching a folded letter, the one that had changed everything. The ink was smudged from her fingertips, but the words were clear enough. "I seek a wife to share a home on the western frontier, must be of honest heart and willing to work. I can offer safety, food, and respect." That last word, respect asterisk, had made her cry. She'd never been given much of it before. Life in the city had been cruel. Long hours, little pay, and men who thought a lonely woman was theirs to claim. She'd worked as a laundress, hands raw from soap and cold water. The boarding house where she stayed was loud, filled with whispers and worn-out souls. Sometimes at night, she'd hear women crying through the walls, some left with men who promised them more. Some never came back. She promised herself she'd find something better, even if she had to cross the country to do it. The letter had come like a spark in the dark. She'd read it over and over, memorizing the man's words, the cowboy's words. His name was John Miller, a man of few lines and simple speech. He wrote about his ranch, his horses, the open land. He said he wanted a partner, not a servant. He didn't mention love, and she liked that. Love was a luxury for other people. What she needed was peace. It took 3 trains and 1 wagon to reach him. Each mile pulled her farther from the life she knew and deeper into the one she'd only dared imagine. At first, she'd watched the changing landscapes with wonder, rivers, forests, mountains that looked like they touched heaven. But as the days dragged on, wonder gave way to worry. What if he wasn't who he claimed to be? What if he was cruel? What if she arrived and he sent her away? The wagon driver was kind enough, an older man with a beard the color of dust. He'd asked her once, "You sure about this, miss? Ain't easy livin' out here." She'd smiled the best she could and said, "I'm not looking for easy." He'd nodded, said nothing more. Maybe he understood. She carried only a few things, a small bag of clothes, a locket with her mother's face, and a Bible she barely read. Everything else she owned fit into her pockets, a hair ribbon, a dried flower, a scrap of lace. Little reminders that she had once belonged somewhere. But as the journey stretched on, she began to realize she'd traded one kind of loneliness for another. The open plains were beautiful, yes, but they were endless, empty. The silence pressed against her ears, until she longed for even the clatter of the city. At night when the wagon stopped, she'd stare up at the stars and think, maybe he's staring at the same ones. It comforted her for a while. The last night before arriving, she barely slept. The driver had warned her they'd reach the Miller ranch by sundown the next day. She'd imagined how it might go. Maybe he'd greet her kindly, maybe with flowers or a handshake or just a nod. But she couldn't shake the thought of all the things that could go wrong. What if he didn't like her face, her voice? What if he changed his mind? She'd seen what happened to women when men changed their minds. As dawn broke, she brushed the dust from her dress and tried to make herself look presentable. The fabric was plain, the color faded, but it was clean. She twisted her hair up and pinned it neatly. The mirror on the side of the wagon showed tired eyes, a mouth that tried to smile and failed. She whispered to her reflection, "You'll be fine, just breathe." But as the day stretched into afternoon, her stomach knotted tighter with every passing mile. The world grew drier, harsher. Trees gave way to flat land and fences. She saw horses grazing in the distance, a barn, a few cows, a field of golden grass waving in the wind. The driver pointed. "That there's the Miller place." Her throat closed up. From a distance the house looked sturdy but lonely. The paint was worn, the roof patched. A wide porch faced the setting sun. A man stood by the fence, tall, broad-shouldered, unmoving. She knew it was him. Even from far away, something about the way he stood, still as the land itself, told her she was looking at her future. The wagon rolled closer. Her heart pounded. She clutched the locket in her hand, her mother's face pressing into her palm. She wanted to turn back, but there was nowhere to go. She told herself this was the life she'd chosen. This was her second chance. When the wagon stopped, the driver tipped his hat. "End of the road, miss." She nodded, barely able to speak. Her hands trembled as she reached for her suitcase. Every sound, the creak of the wheels, the horse's breath, the wind, seemed too loud. She stepped down, her boots sinking into the dirt. The ground felt unsteady, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She looked at the man by the fence. He hadn't moved. His face was half hidden by shadow, but she could see the shape of his jaw, the faint glint of his eyes. This was it. No more letters, no more waiting. Just two strangers bound by a promise written on paper and sealed with hope. Her pulse roared in her ears. She took one hesitant step forward. Then another. The distance between them felt miles long, though it was only a few yards. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. Just stood there like he was measuring her, weighing who she might be. In that moment she felt every choice she'd ever made. Every hurt, every risk, every whisper of doubt. She wanted to speak, to say something polite, something that would make this easier. But the words stuck. Instead, she just stared and prayed that the man she was promised to was the same man from the letters. The wind blew through her hair. The sky dimmed. The wagon rolled away behind her, leaving a cloud of dust. She didn't turn to watch it go. She couldn't, because if she did, she might never find the courage to look forward again. He watched her step off the wagon like a man studying a stranger's shadow. She was smaller than he'd imagined, pale under the weight of travel and fear. The wind caught her skirt, tugged at her bonnet, but she didn't look away. Not at first. Then her eyes darted to the ground, and that told him plenty. He'd seen that look before, not from a wife, but from a wild horse the first time you reach for the reins. Too many people came west looking for freedom and found something worse. He didn't speak right away. The land didn't like noise. Out here, silence had meaning. He let her stand there, let the dust settle around her boots, and waited. Then he said it slow, low, the way he might talk to a nervous colt. "Darlin, I don't bite." He saw her shoulders tense. That old fear flared in her eyes, so he added, half under his breath, "Unless you're fixin' to run." She blinked, confused. His tone wasn't cruel, but she couldn't read it. Was it a joke? A warning? His mouth twitched just enough to suggest he'd meant both. The air between them seemed to hum. For a long moment, neither moved. The driver cleared his throat, tipping his hat before turning the wagon around. The horses snorted, hooves clattering on hard earth. When they disappeared down the road, the quiet grew heavier. She swallowed, clutching the handle of her suitcase like it might keep her safe. "Mr. Miller," she asked softly. "That's me," he said. "You can call me John." She nodded. I know who you are." He pointed toward the house behind him, the boards bleached silver by years of sun. "Let's get you settled." Her steps were small, careful, as she followed him up the path. Each crunch of gravel underfoot echoed in her chest. The porch creaked. The air smelled of rain that never came. When he opened the door, she hesitated before crossing the threshold, as if stepping inside would seal her fate. The cabin was plain but tidy. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace with a kettle hanging above faint embers. Against one wall stood a bed, hers, she guessed. Against the other, a rifle rested on hooks. He set her bag down and gestured to a stool. "You look like you could use water," she nodded. Her throat felt like sandpaper. He poured from a clay jug, the sound of it oddly soothing. She drank, hands trembling. The cool water grounded her, though not enough to chase away the tension. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Long ride?" "Yes, sir." "No need for sir." His voice was calm, even. "I ain't much for fancy words." She tried to smile but failed. The room seemed too small for the space between them. He studied her in silence, not rudely but with a kind of curiosity. "You eat?" She shook her head. "Kitchen's out back. You'll find bread, beans, maybe some ham if the coyotes didn't beat me to it." She gave a small nod and stood, unsure if she should thank him or apologize for existing. He motioned her toward the door instead. Outside, the air had cooled. The sun sat low behind the hills, painting the fields in gold. Chickens pecked near the fence, unbothered. Somewhere a horse snorted, stamping its hooves. He followed her outside, staying a few steps behind. "You'll get used to it," he said after a while. "Used to what?" "The quiet, the work, the distance between things." She didn't answer. Her eyes followed the horizon, endless and open, and for a second she felt the weight of how far she was from everything she'd ever known. He watched her, reading that silence like a book. "You from back east?" "Yes." "A city? That why you look at the ground so much?" She frowned. "I don't," he smiled, small but real this time. "City folks always do. Out here the ground don't tell you much. You learn to watch the sky instead." The way he said it, soft but sure, made her look up. The sky was wide and pale, the first stars already blinking to life. She exhaled without realizing it. He took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and nodded toward the barn. "You'll hear the coyotes tonight. Don't be scared. They talk more than they bite." That almost drew a smile from her. Almost. They stood there a while longer, neither sure what to say. He wasn't used to company. She wasn't used to kindness that didn't come with a price. The air between them held the hum of something fragile, something new. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than the wind. "Why me?" He glanced at her, then back toward the fading light. "You answered." She waited for more, but he didn't explain. Instead, he turned, walking toward the corral. "Supper at 7, he said over his shoulder. "We eat by the fire." She watched him go, his figure framed by the dying sun, the brim of his hat catching the last glow of day. Something in her chest twisted, fear, maybe, or the start of something she couldn't name. Inside the cabin, she sat on the edge of the bed, the boards creaking beneath her. She ran her fingers along the worn quilt, the handmade stitches, the smell of smoke that clung to everything. In her pocket, the locket felt heavy. She opened it and stared at her mother's face, soft eyes, gentle smile. "I'm here," she whispered. "I made it." The floorboards groaned as he came back inside. He didn't speak, just placed a folded blanket near the fire. The faint glow lit his face now, revealing tired eyes and a scar that ran along his jaw. He caught her staring and said quietly, "This place ain't much, but it's safe. You can rest easy." She nodded, though she doubted she'd sleep. He turned to hang his coat, and for a moment his shadow stretched across the wall beside hers, 2 shapes, close but not touching. The wind howled outside. The fire crackled. Somewhere beyond the ranch, the coyotes began to sing. She closed her eyes and listened, the sound strange yet oddly comforting, like a language she almost understood. The first few days passed in silence. Morning came early on the ranch, and before the sun had fully risen, the sound of roosters and creaking wood filled the air. She learned that John woke with the dawn, his boots already on before the light touched the windows. By the time she came out, he'd be outside feeding the horses, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up, arms glistening with sweat from work that seemed endless. She tried to keep busy, though she often didn't know what to do. The chores weren't like anything she'd known in the city. Out there, her hands had scrubbed laundry, folded sheets, polished floors, all inside, all small. But here, work stretched as far as the land did. There were chickens to feed, water to carry, bread to bake, and dust that never stopped coming back no matter how often she swept. He didn't tell her what to do. He just watched quietly, letting her find her own rhythm. She appreciated that, though it made her uneasy too. She wasn't used to silence that didn't judge. Sometimes she'd glance through the window while kneading dough, watching him move across the field, slow and steady, like a man at peace with his own shadow. She wondered if he ever felt lonely. On the third morning he brought her a pair of gloves. They were worn, one finger patched with thread but clean. "You'll tear your hands otherwise," he said. She took them carefully, her fingers brushing his for the first time. His hands were rough, strong, but his touch was gentle, almost shy. She wanted to thank him, but the words caught. He didn't seem to expect any, just nodded and walked back outside. The days were long and quiet, broken only by the rhythm of work, the thud of hooves, the scrape of a shovel, the whistle of the wind through the barn. She found herself growing used to it, to the stillness of the land and the steady calm that seemed to follow him everywhere. But every so often, a shadow of fear returned, that small, sharp reminder that she was living under a stranger's roof, bound to him by words on paper. One evening, while setting the table, she heard him humming, low, tuneless, almost absent-minded. It startled her more than if he'd shouted. He caught her staring and paused mid-note, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "Didn't think cowboys could sing," she shook her head, smiling faintly. "I just didn't expect you to." "Don't worry," he said, setting a pot of stew on the table. "I ain't any good at it." Dinner that night was easier than the ones before. They ate in comfortable silence, the crackle of fire filling the gaps where conversation might have gone. She watched him ladle stew into her bowl, careful not to spill. He asked if she liked it. She said yes, though the meat was tough. He smiled as if that small word yes meant more than it should have. When night came, she lay awake listening to the wind. It rattled the shutters, whispered through the cracks in the wall. She could hear him moving in the next room, slow footsteps on wood, then stillness. For the first time, she didn't feel afraid of the dark. She felt something else, not comfort, not yet, but something close. By the end of the week, she began to move with the rhythm of the ranch. She'd rise early, pull her hair back, and start the fire before he returned from the barn. He never asked her to, she just wanted to. There was a quiet pride in being useful, in having something to do that mattered. One afternoon, she tried to carry a pail of water from the well, too full for her strength. She stumbled halfway, water sloshing over her boots. He saw from across the yard and came over, taking the handle from her. "You don't have to do everything alone," he said, not unkindly. She looked up at him, breathless. "I'm used to it. I can tell." His eyes held hers just a moment too long. Then he lifted the bucket with one hand, carried it like it weighed nothing, and walked back toward the house. She followed, unsure if she was grateful or embarrassed. Later that evening, a storm rolled in from the west. The wind howled across the plains, rattling windows, slamming doors. She tried to latch the shutters, but the force nearly tore them from her hands. He appeared behind her, steadying the frame with his shoulder. "It's stronger than it looks," he said. Lightning flashed. For a heartbeat, his face was lit in silver, calm, composed, unafraid. She stepped back, her pulse racing. He caught her wrist before she stumbled, holding it firmly, not harshly. "You all right?" She nodded barely. His hand lingered a second longer before he let go. "You'll get used to it," he said again. After the storm passed, the ranch glistened in moonlight, every puddle reflecting the stars. The air smelled of wet soil and cedar. She stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the frogs start their midnight songs. He joined her quietly, leaning on the railing. First storm's always the hardest, he said. She looked out at the endless dark. I thought it'd tear the house apart. He chuckled softly. Built it myself. Ain't much, but it holds. She glanced at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she believed him, not just about the house, but about everything. For a long while, neither spoke. The night was full of sound, crickets, dripping water, the slow breath of the wind, yet somehow peaceful. She found herself breathing easier, the knot in her chest loosening with each passing minute. Then he turned slightly, his voice quiet, almost thoughtful. You keep waiting for me to prove something. Her heart stilled. I don't, he looked at her, steady and sure. It's all right. Folks who've been hurt don't trust words. They watch what you do. She didn't answer. There was nothing to say. He straightened, tugged his hat low again. Well, you'll see soon enough. I ain't here to hurt you. Never was. And just like that he walked away, boots thudding softly against the porch. She stayed there long after, watching the stars blink over the horizon, the blanket tight around her shoulders. Somewhere in the distance, the coyotes began to cry again, long, low, mournful sounds that didn't seem to scare her anymore. The air carried the faint smell of rain and smoke, and beneath it, something new, something like safety. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered for days. The air smelled cleaner, sharper, like the world had been washed and hung out to dry. She woke to the sound of dripping eaves and the low murmur of John's voice outside. He was talking to the horses, his tone easy and low, the kind people use with creatures they trust. She watched from the window for a moment, his silhouette framed by the light breaking over the fields. Something in her chest stirred, something she couldn't quite name, but it scared her more than the storm had. By now she'd learned the rhythm of the ranch. The morning chores, the quiet meals, the way John moved through each day like he belonged to the land itself. He rarely raised his voice, never rushed, never seemed lost. But she noticed things, small things, that made her curious. The way he'd stop sometimes, staring out at the horizon as if expecting something or someone. The way his hand brushed a scar on his forearm, like a memory still tender beneath the skin. She wanted to ask, but she didn't. Not yet. The sky stayed gray that morning, heavy with clouds that refused to break. She decided to bring him coffee. It wasn't much, but it was something. She poured it into a tin mug, stepping carefully across the yard. He looked up when she approached, surprise flickering across his face. Brought you this, she said, holding it out. He took it, fingers brushing hers. You didn't have to. I know. She shifted, unsure what else to say. He studied her for a moment, then nodded once. Thank you. It was just 2 words, but they carried warmth. He took a sip and smiled slightly. You make it strong. She smiled back. It's the only way I know. That small exchange hung between them like sunlight breaking through clouds. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was trust beginning to take shape, fragile and unspoken. Later that afternoon, while she was folding linens near the window, a rider appeared on the road. Dust rose behind him like smoke. John stepped out onto the porch, hand instinctively brushing the pistol on his hip. The man dismounted, tall and lean, with eyes that didn't belong to a friend. Afternoon, the stranger called. Heard you took yourself a wife. John didn't answer. He just stood there silent, the space between them charged like the sky before lightning. The stranger grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. Mail-order, wasn't she? Can't imagine she came cheap. Her breath caught. The words hit like a slap. John's jaw tightened. You got business here, or you just aim to talk yourself into trouble? The man laughed. Always so polite, Miller, just passing through. Thought I'd see if the rumors were true. His eyes shifted toward her, visible through the window. Pretty little thing, you sure she's here by choice? She froze, hands gripping the fabric too tight. John stepped forward, voice low. You need to leave. The stranger tilted his hat. Easy, friend. Didn't mean nothing by it. He climbed back onto his horse, smirking. Enjoy your new bride. When he rode off, John stayed still, watching until the dust settled and the sound of hooves faded into the hills. Then he turned toward the window. Their eyes met, and for a moment she saw something raw in his face, anger, yes, but also shame. That evening he barely spoke during supper. The silence felt heavier than before. She tried to eat, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling. Finally, she set down her fork. Who was he? John didn't look up. Nobody worth remembering. Did he mean what he said? He exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. Men like him don't mean half of what they say. They just want to see if they can scare someone. She hesitated. It worked. He looked at her then, really looked, and something in his eyes softened. I'd never let anyone hurt you, he said quietly. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let those words be enough. But the fear had already crept back in, curling itself deep inside her chest. The next morning she didn't come down for breakfast. She stayed in her room, staring out at the wide, endless land. She thought she could handle this, new beginnings, new risks, but now she wasn't sure. The stranger's words had cracked something inside her, the fragile shell she'd built around her hope. Around noon, there was a knock on the door. You all right? John's voice came through, gentle but steady. She didn't answer. He waited a moment, then said, I'm taking the wagon to town, need supplies, be back before sundown. The door stayed closed. She heard his footsteps fade, then the distant rumble of wheels on dirt. When the sound disappeared, she sat down on the bed and cried for the first time since arriving. Not loud, not broken, just quiet tears, the kind that leave you empty when they're done. By the time he returned, the sky was orange again. She'd cleaned the table, lit the fire, tried to act like nothing had happened. He came in carrying sacks of flour and sugar, dust clinging to his hat. I brought you something, he said, setting a small wrapped bundle on the table. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a book, worn leather, pages yellowed with time, a collection of poems. Found it at the general store, he said. Figured you might miss reading. Her hands shook as she traced the cover. Why are you being so kind to me? He shrugged, eyes steady on hers. Because I remember what it feels like to start over. Something in her chest loosened. For the first time, she felt the truth in his quietness. The way he spoke less because he'd already said too much once in his life. She wanted to ask what he'd lost, but she knew better than to push. That night as they sat by the fire, she opened the book and read aloud. Her voice trembled at first, but then grew steady. He listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the flames. When she finished the poem, he said softly, You've got a way of making even silence sound like something worth hearing. Her cheeks warmed. You're teasing me. He shook his head. Not this time. The fire popped and the shadows on the walls swayed. She looked at him, and in that moment the fear that had haunted her since she arrived began to fade, not gone, not forgotten, but weaker. She realized then that maybe the stranger's cruelty had given her something unexpected. It had shown her who John really was, and what kind of man stood between her and the world. He turned toward her, expression unreadable but eyes kind. Darlin, I told you before, he said quietly, I don't bite, not when you're on my side. The words landed soft as a promise, and for the first time she believed them. The morning after felt different. The air was clearer, softer somehow, and the wind that swept across the valley carried the scent of wet grass and sunlight. She woke before the rooster crowed, slipping quietly out of bed. The fire in the stove had gone cold, but she didn't mind the chill. She liked the stillness before the day began, the moment where everything waited, breath held, for life to start again. She stepped outside and found John already awake, standing by the fence line. He was mending a post, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a faint tune humming under his breath. When he saw her, he nodded, tipping his hat slightly. It wasn't much, but it was more than most mornings. She walked toward him, her steps light, almost uncertain. Couldn't sleep? He asked, not looking up from his work. She shook her head. Didn't want to waste the day. Good way to think, he said, driving a nail into the wood with one clean strike. There's always something that needs doing. She smiled faintly. You don't ever stop, do you? He paused, setting the hammer down. If I stop, I start thinking too much. So no. For a moment neither spoke. The land around them glowed with early light, the grass damp from the night's dew. A hawk circled above, its cry sharp against the silence. She leaned against the fence, watching the horses graze in the field. One of them, a young mare, flicked its tail and trotted toward her, curious and unafraid. "She likes you," John said quietly. The horse nuzzled her hand, warm breath brushing her skin. "She's beautiful," she whispered. "Lost her mother young," he replied. "Had to learn to trust all over again." The words lingered between them, heavier than they sounded. She stroked the mare's mane, her throat tightening. "Takes time, doesn't it?" "Yeah," he said, his gaze distant. "But it's worth it." Later, as they worked side by side, she tending to the garden, him hauling feed, she realized how easy it felt now. The awkward silences that used to hang like fog had thinned. They spoke more, laughed occasionally, even disagreed once or twice, and it didn't break the air between them. He teased her about overwatering the plants. She teased him about talking to his horses more than to people. The simplicity of it made her heart ache in ways she hadn't expected. That afternoon, the sun turned hot. The air shimmered, and the sound of cicadas rose in a steady hum. She sat in the shade of the porch, fanning herself with a bit of paper. John came up from the barn, wiping sweat from his brow. "Storm clouds are building in the south," he said, glancing toward the horizon. She followed his gaze. A faint smudge of gray was forming, curling like smoke. "Another one, maybe," he said. "Can't ever tell this time of year." He took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and looked at her with a small, almost teasing smile. "You handled the last one fine. Don't see why you'd be scared now." She raised a brow. "You think I was scared? I know you were." "Well," she said, trying to hide her grin, "maybe a little." He laughed then, a sound she hadn't heard before. It was low and warm, like the crackle of firewood. She couldn't help but laugh too. For a moment the world felt light, easy. By evening the storm had drifted elsewhere, leaving only a golden sky behind. They ate dinner on the porch, watching the light fade over the hills. The air smelled of sage and dust, and the crickets began their song. "You ever think about going back?" he asked suddenly. She looked at him, surprised. "Back where?" "Wherever you came from," she hesitated. "No, there's nothing left for me there," he nodded slowly. "That's what I figured." "What about you?" she asked. "You ever think of leaving?" He shook his head. "This land's in my bones. My pa built this place and his before him. I reckon I'll die here." There was no sadness in his voice, only truth. She admired that. A man who didn't need the world to change for him. He just lived in it, steady as the ground he worked on. The night crept in soft and cool. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, and the moon climbed pale over the ridge. She leaned her elbows on the railing, listening to the slow rhythm of the crickets. "John," she said after a long pause. When you said you don't bite," she smiled faintly, her eyes on the horizon. "What did you mean by that?" he chuckled. "Thought you'd forgotten that line." "I didn't." He took a moment before answering, his voice quieter now. "I meant I ain't here to hurt you, but I've got my temper like any man, and I expect honesty. You lie to me, you'll see the part that bites." She looked over at him. "And if I don't," he met her eyes, "then you'll never have to find out." They sat in silence again, the kind that didn't feel empty anymore. The moonlight painted everything silver, the fields, the house, even the lines of his face. She realized then that she wasn't afraid of him, not anymore. She was afraid of how safe he made her feel. He stood after a while, stretching his shoulders. "I'll be up early. Need to ride into town tomorrow." "You can come if you like," she blinked. "You want me to?" He gave a half smile. "Only if you want to see how wild the West can get." Her laugh came easy this time. "I might just take you up on that." When he went inside, she stayed on the porch, tracing the rim of her cup with her thumb. The stars above were so bright they didn't seem real. She thought about how far she'd come, from the smoke-choked city to this open stretch of sky, and how strange it felt to belong to something again. Behind her, the floorboards creaked softly. He was there, leaning against the doorway. "Don't stay up too late," he said, his voice low, rough with fatigue. "I won't." He nodded, watching her a moment longer before stepping back into the house. The door clicked shut, and the sound seemed to settle deep inside her. She looked back at the sky, the endless dark filled with tiny sparks of light. The night air wrapped around her like a whisper. Somewhere out there, the world kept turning, but for now, this quiet, this place, this man felt enough. The wind brushed her cheek, warm and tender. She closed her eyes and let it linger, the smallest smile tugging at her lips.